Russian oligarchs have mind-boggling wealth.
Russia's economy is bleeding out.
The banking crisis in Russia is certainly a juicy one.
Take a good look at this image. Two leaders, red carpets and an unshakable pose of unity defying the West. The scene is perfect for grandiose propaganda based on unlimited partnership and friendship without forbidden zones. Russia is now fighting not only against the West, but also against the silent betrayal of its greatest ally. Putin's imperial dreams ended not in the trenches of Ukraine or with Western sanctions, but with an export ban from Beijing. The heart of the war machine has been stopped. Russia is now technologically isolated, fragile, and closer to collapse than ever before. This was the defining geopolitical relationship of the 21st century. On paper, it was an unstoppable alliance. Russia's vast military and energy resources were combined with China's unshakable industrial might. Vladimir Putin trusted this unlimited partnership as the strongest wall in the fortress he built against the West. This alliance was the lifeline, the economic and technological life support unit that enabled the Kremlin to continue its war in Ukraine. Every handshake, every joint exercise, every official statement sent a single message to the world. Russia is not alone. No matter how high the West's wall of sanctions rose, Beijing's support would render it meaningless. This was Putin's greatest trump card, his most unshakable belief. Not anymore. Just a few weeks ago, behind closed doors, Beijing plunged a dagger into the heart of this alliance with a single bureaucratic order. While the state-controlled Global Times newspaper hailed these moments as the dawn of a new era, the Russian news agency RIA Novosti ran headlines proclaiming the Eurasian fortress against Western hegemony. This was a carefully coordinated show of force, designed both to consolidate domestic audiences and to demonstrate to the world that they offer an alternative center of power. But behind this grandeur lies a deep history of mistrust, inherited from the Sino-Soviet split, border conflicts, and Moscow's historical arrogance, which once viewed Beijing as a little brother. But what if this alliance is less a union of interests and more an asymmetrical dynamic of exploitation, where one side capitalizes on the other's weaknesses? This was not a missile strike. It was not a sanctions package. It was a silent industrial isolation engineered by a power that appeared to be an ally. Beijing made a sudden decision, and with that decision, Russia's ability to maintain a modern army ended not theoretically, but practically. This is the beginning of a war lost not on the battlefield, but in a factory, through betrayal. China is dealing a major blow to Vladimir Putin and his military-industrial complex by restricting exports of high-precision equipment to Russia. High-tech machine tools are vital to helping Russia produce weapons for its war in Ukraine. It is reported that Beijing has tightened its export restrictions, making it nearly impossible for Russia to obtain Chinese machine tools with 3 to 4 micron precision. Ildar Nureyev, owner of Tatpromstan, confirmed this bad news at the Temp Forum on metal processing and layered technologies. Nureyev said, "China has restricted the supply of high-tech equipment, but this is rarely mentioned. While it used to be possible to obtain 3 to 4 micron precision machine tools, it is no longer possible. A special export license is required." He added that these restrictions are a sign of Beijing's reluctance to develop partnerships with Russian companies. New data showing an overall decline in trade between China and Russia has dealt another blow to the Kremlin. China has become one of Russia's most important economic and political partners since Putin launched a full-scale war against Ukraine in 2022 and the West imposed sanctions. Last year, the total value of imports and exports between the two countries reached $244.8 billion. The Chinese president has repeatedly emphasized the close relationship between the two countries, saying, "The two countries have consistently moved forward hand in hand on the path of neutrality." Both leaders have spoken many times of an unlimited partnership. Despite these statements of eternal friendship and cooperation, data from the Chinese Customs Administration shows a clear cooling in trade. In August, shipments of Chinese goods to the Russian market fell by 16.4% year-on-year. This is double the 8.6% decline seen in July. Over 7,500 trucks and trailers are stranded, inspections are ongoing, and goods are being seized. Drones, electronic warfare equipment, batteries, components, nothing is getting through. Initially, Russian authorities were searching every vehicle at the Kazakh border and allowing passage only under strict rules. Satellite images and videos from local sources document miles of helplessly waiting truck queues stretching across Kazakhstan's endless steppes. The numbers reveal the gravity of the situation. Initially, a few hundred stranded vehicles quickly grew to thousands. Then, as confirmed by independent logistics platforms and even Kazakh MPs, reached an unimaginable 7,500. The queues stretch for miles. Fearing inspections, many drivers enter parking lots or seek alternative routes through Mongolia. Those caught in the middle of this chaos were not only Russians and Kazakhs. A significant portion of that massive convoy consisted of Chinese drivers bringing goods directly from the source. These people, who had been on the road for weeks, stranded in a geography where they did not know the language or the rules, began to tremble with fear of being subjected to Russia's arbitrary seizures, heavy fines, and prison sentences for absurd charges such as smuggling. Russian customs officials began meticulously searching nearly all sensitive cargo, subject to Western sanctions or suspected of being dual use. These inspections took days, even weeks. This situation not only extended delivery times by weeks, but also halted the flow of parts and raw materials vital to Russian industry, bringing production to a standstill. Fearing the inspections, many Chinese and Kazakh drivers either pulled into parking lots to wait or began looking for alternative, much more expensive routes through Mongolia. Their goal was to avoid being at the mercy of a Russian customs officer and having their loaded cargo held hostage for days. This situation not only extended delivery times by weeks, but also halted production by cutting off the flow of parts and raw materials vital to Russian industry. Russian factories are waiting for parts. Those parts are being held hostage by Russian customs officials at the Russian border. The chaos at the border was not a simple traffic jam. It was the result of a ruthless game of diplomatic chess being played behind the scenes. The West's, particularly the US's, diplomatic pressure and threat of secondary sanctions on countries within Russia's traditional sphere of influence, such as Kazakhstan, was the main factor triggering this logistical disaster. Kazakhstan had to sacrifice Russia in order to protect its own economy and not risk its relations with the West. This was a move that showed how fragile Putin's influence over his so-called allies was and diplomatically cornered him. Putin and Xi Jinping had declared unlimited friendship to the world. However, this crisis proved how fake and based on mistrust this friendship was. Underlying Russia's initiation of these strict controls was the suspicion that Chinese companies, fearing secondary sanctions from the West, were either not sending sensitive products to Russia or were sending substandard goods. Moscow feared that Beijing was deceiving it and not providing sufficient support. On the other hand, for China, every truck waiting at the border meant a loss. One of the most important land corridors of China's Belt and Road project, extending to Europe, was blocked due to the incompetence and paranoia of its ally, Russia. This showed that the interests of the two countries did not fully coincide. While China wanted to use Russia as an ally against the West, the economic and logistical chaos Russia had fallen into was also becoming a burden for China. If this border crisis lasted more than 30 days, Chinese companies would begin to withdraw from the Russian market, and unlimited friendship would officially come to an end. After the invasion of Ukraine, while the West imposed the heaviest sanctions in history to isolate Putin, Beijing appeared as a savior. It bought Russian oil at a discount, fueled the war machine with civilian technologies, and invaded markets abandoned by Western companies. But this is not a rescue operation. It is a predatory policy of active exploitation of Russia's helplessness. This relationship is not an alliance, but a ruthless game played by a superior economic power, maximizing its advantage over a weakened and isolated state. What do you do when your most trusted ally, while appearing to rescue you, is actually accelerating the internal decay of your country? August 2025, customs data signaled the first cracks in this decay. Trade volume plummeted by double-digit figures, but this was merely a surface crack. The real destruction is taking place in the invisible veins of the financial system, in an operation that is slowly suffocating Russia. This is not a lifeline thrown to Moscow by Beijing. It is a shackle that is slowly consuming Russia's strategic autonomy. And each link in this shackle has been forged by Beijing's cold and calculated interests, The collapse of propaganda begins with concrete data. To understand the true nature of this relationship, we must examine three main axes: energy, trade, and finance. China, which accounted for approximately 18% of Russian trade before the war, has now pushed this figure above 30%. Its share of Russian oil exports has doubled, exceeding 50%. The share of Chinese car brands such as Chery and Great Wall in the Russian market has skyrocketed from a modest 9% to over 51%, capturing more than half of the market. This is not a partnership, but a takeover of the market. So how can a country remain a friend at the cost of destroying its own industry? This is the story of Russia's deindustrialization and its condemnation to a resource curse. This is not just a trade imbalance. It is the tragedy of Russia becoming a vast dumping ground for China's industrial overproduction, instead of rebuilding its own production capacity. Once an industrial powerhouse boasting its own space program, today it is forced to produce cars without airbags or modern braking systems in its Lada factories, while its roads are flooded with China's latest SUV models. This is a tangible collapse happening before the people's eyes. The country is becoming a dumping ground for China's industrial production surplus instead of developing technology. This dependence extends to the battlefield. Modern warfare relies on drones that direct artillery fire and instantly identify targets. The Russian army's critical capacity in this area relies heavily on civilian drones produced by Chinese brands such as DJI and Autel. This is evidence of a critical failure within Moscow's own military-industrial complex and its shameful dependence on Beijing. By turning a blind eye to these grey market sales, Beijing is preventing Russia's complete collapse, but it is also holding Moscow's most basic war capabilities hostage to Chinese supply chains. However, the most lethal blow is the invisible embargo known as the Financial Great Wall of China, which overshadows all these economic asymmetries. This is where Beijing destroys its own unlimited partnership narrative with its own hands. China's largest state banks, giants such as the Bank of China and ICBC, restricted transactions with sanctioned Russian banks immediately after the invasion, complying with directives from the US Treasury Department. This was not passive compliance, but an active self-preservation strategy. Chinese banks began demanding written confirmation from Russian importers that their transactions had no connection to sanctioned individuals or the Donbass region. This policy reached its peak when Zhejiang Chozhou Commercial Bank, which had played a key role for Russian importers in recent months, halted all transactions with Russia. Although this may appear to be the decision of a single bank, the shockwaves it created spread throughout the entire Russian economy. This is because the decision showed that even China's smallest, most flexible banks were avoiding risk. This is not a coincidence, but an active choice. Why would one strategic partner deliberately cut off the other's financial lifeline? The answer lies in a single word that spells the failure of the modern economy: barter. That is, exchange. While this may sound like an echo from the past, it has become a bitter reality for today's Russia. Russia, a nuclear power, is forced to trade oil for cars and wheat for construction machinery, even with its largest partner in the 21st century. Because Beijing does not want to cut off trade, but systematically avoids joining the payment system to avoid the risk of being excluded from the global dollar system. The barter system is a nightmare for modern trade. It is fraught with enormous obstacles such as valuation issues, logistical complexities, and a lack of insurance and financial guarantees. The fact that a nuclear power is forced to resort to this primitive method is the most painful admission of how excluded it is from the international financial system and how it has been abandoned even by its closest ally. This is not about saving Russia, but about leaving it weak and dependent. This is not a mistake, but a deliberate strategy. China's actions are not only pragmatic but also predatory. Beijing is consciously exploiting Moscow's helplessness, transforming the relationship into a neo-colonial model. Russia as a captive source of resources and a protected market for Chinese industrial goods. This demonstrates the active exploitation of Russia's helplessness rather than passive support. The domino effect triggered by this situation is shaking the foundations of the Russian state and accelerating internal decay. Financial channels are shutting down. This makes it impossible for Russian manufacturers to import the critical non-Chinese components they need for production, such as a German-made machine part. This triggers a phenomenon known as industrial cannibalism. Factories begin dismantling working machines to provide spare parts. This is an act of desperation that saves today but destroys tomorrow. The defense industry is falling behind technologically, deprived of high-tech chips and sensors. And ultimately, the army on the front lines is deprived of modern equipment, suffers more losses, and experiences a collapse in morale. Putin's Russia is going bankrupt. After nearly 22 years of glorious times, the country is now at the most critical juncture in its economic history.
Food crisis.
The food crisis is worsening.
And in the middle of the war, it's a growing food crisis.
Billions of rubles are going to the war zone. Unemployment is rising, real incomes are falling, and budget deficits are reaching record levels. People may not be protesting in the streets, but they are doing so within their homes. Pockets are burning, families are breaking up. Moreover, it is not just money that is running out, but also human resources. Those who have the opportunity are fleeing the country, even Putin's elite ranks. The number of people to work in factories is decreasing. Russia's labor shortage is constantly increasing compared to previous years. According to data from the Russian Ministry of Labor, it is predicted that the Russian economy will need 10.9 million new workers by 2030. Losses on the front lines, the inability to employ young workers to replace retirees, and those fleeing the country are triggering this. The Kremlin, which is constantly sending soldiers to the front, is trying to compensate for the labor shortage in the domestic market with migrant labor. But this is not enough either. The state's hope is turning back to oil. However, oil and natural gas are no longer Putin's trump card, but one of the only factors cushioning Russia's defeat in the war. 13.5% of refineries are closed, reserves are running out, and imports are limited. Consequently, Russia's closest allies are planning to abandon the sinking ship, economically speaking. China is one of the most important examples of this. It is known that Chinese banks have turned off the money tap to Russia. The situation has become so critical that the Kremlin is now approaching the white flag not only on the front lines, but also in the treasury. At this point, everything needs to be discussed openly. The fact that the targeted deficit ratio for the first half of the year was reached long ago indicates that the pace of spending has crushed the revenue dynamics. The math of this equation, written by the decline in energy revenues and the increase in spending, is simple. The government will have to use reserves to close the gap and discuss new budget revisions as the year progresses. The share of defense and security spending in the total has reached historic levels, and the side effect of this is pressure on social spending and investment budgets. As long as interest rates remain in double digits, it is difficult for investment appetite to make a permanent comeback. Therefore, official growth expectations are being revised downward. The cost of credit is high, demand is fragile, and the private sector is cautious. The loss of momentum in domestic demand and delays in investment projects are creating an agenda that focuses more on cash flow than ratings. The triple whammy of high war spending, plus weak energy prices, plus expensive credit, leaves the economic management with a narrow corridor. Every step taken in this corridor makes the next decision even more costly. As oil and its derivatives, the most critical item on the revenue side, continue to lag behind desired ruble levels, the budget math breaks down. The ruble's periodic strengthening and the softening of global oil prices are leading to a realization below the ruble target per barrel. This exacerbates cash flow problems and brings forward the need for additional financing. When controls in the supply chain and the tightening of price cap regimes are added to this, discount pressure becomes inevitable. Regulatory steps in the port, tanker, and insurance triangle increase shadow fleet risk premiums. On the European side, successive sanctions packages are hitting both energy revenues and access to critical technology. The scope of these sanctions, extending to ships, finance, intermediary channels, and intermediate goods, makes circumvention moves costly. The signal for the next steps is also clear. The focus of new sanctions is to narrow banking, energy transportation, and sanctions circumvention methods. In short, on the revenue side, collection is difficult, the risk premium is high, and the discount is permanent. This picture shows that the Treasury is waking up to a more difficult arithmetic every month. Now let's get to the most critical link: financing channels. Access to Western finance has long been restricted. The aim was to partially compensate for this gap through Asia. However, As the risk of secondary sanctions grows, major Asian banks are also avoiding visible risk. Over the past year, Chinese banks have either delayed or completely cut off numerous transactions, creating a necessity to shift to local indirect models. This is a clear setback in terms of speed and cost. More importantly, there have been clear examples of even small regional banks in China halting Russian transactions. Moreover, this restriction is not limited to a single bank. It is part of a broader cautious approach. As a result, the payment side of trade is becoming more complex, slower, and more open to scrutiny. Russian companies are forced to open intermediary accounts in China and manage payment flows using a split approach. This increases friction at every stage of trade and prolongs cash flow. In this environment, Russian banks have attempted to reduce visibility by establishing netting arrangements known as the Chaina line. The netting scheme aims to close transactions using the logic of offsetting rather than direct interbank transfers. But such an architecture faces speed and scale issues, and windows are shrinking as counterparty compliance tests increase. It is even known that large state banks have silenced certain channels in response to the risk of sanctions expansion. This pushes the Russian side to fragment flows and add more intermediaries. Each new intermediary, each new account, means cost and delay.